It's flowing. Now we've got good flow. When it starts to melt, you're doing good. And you want it to just flow all the way in and permeate the wire. This side isn't quite hot enough yet, but it's getting there. So I just touched the iron, that's why it gave a little bit of smoke. Trying to get that little ball of solder off of there. And once you have solder on the wire, it will usually flow pretty good, unless you got really thick wire. And then you wouldn't use this anyway. So anyways, once you get the solder flowing and you feel like it's done a good job, hold your iron to it for just a little bit, then take it off. Okay, I'm going to turn this off now because we're done with it. And you can see where it burned that block. So anything that you press that up against is going to get burned. Just know that. Okay, so now, see we've got, there it is. We've got good permeation on the solder. It goes from end to end, right there, and it's nice and smooth, you know. Little bits of lumps, okay, it's not a big deal as long as they're smooth lumps. You don't want any jagged edges. If you've got jagged edges, that means that you didn't have the wire hot and the solder melted because it was near the iron, and when you pulled the iron away, it left a little mountaintop, like a little, what are those things called? Stalagmites off the bottom. Mites are off the bottom, tights are off the top. So anyways, when you pulled the iron away, it pulled the solder away, and then it just made a sharp edge. So you want to avoid that. Okay, so now what we're going to do, we're going to let that iron cool a little bit, and I'm going to switch the tip. We're going to go with heat shrink now, which as soon as I find it, because I dropped it. Okay, here we go. Heat shrink. Heat shrink is just, it looks like a little black plastic tube. I don't know, does anybody make this in color? I don't know, I've only ever seen black. It'd be neat if they made it in color, that way you could color match the wire. Probably be expensive though. You want to cover the entire soldered area, the entire exposed area, I should say. Now as you can see, this heat shrink is a good bit longer, and it looks like it's huge in diameter compared to this wire, and you're right, it is. It will shrink down. A note about heat shrink. Heat shrink has an adhesive inside of it that when you get this hot, it will melt. It'll look like a clear yellowish goo. You can use that when you solder, or when you put the heat shrink on. When you heat shrink it and it gets down nice and small, you can kind of squish the ends and it'll squish some of that off and seal it off nice and tight when it dries. Heat shrink is extremely useful. It comes in many diameters and it works phenomenally. I've used it from like little teeny tiny stuff all the way up to huge, gigantic, like heat shrink tubes like that big. Seriously, that big. It was on cables that went on compressors, but it worked like a champ, and it's great. And this stuff is pretty inexpensive. You can buy it by the stick, like it'll come in like really long sections, come in short sections. You can buy it by the roll if you're really ambitious and you feel like you can do a lot of it. Most of the time, buying a package of it and the sticks will work. So what we're going to do, I don't need this much heat shrink to cover it. Basically, you would want it to be covered about that much. Okay, like I was telling you, we're going to check to see the stiffness. Now, this is a test you do to see your solder. If you do your solder, see how it bends? Now see right here, that's where solder flowed up inside the insulation. It's not necessarily bad, but you don't want that to be more than 1/4 of an inch or so. If it's 1/4 of an inch, you have a really stiff portion of the wire, and that's going to be bad for you. It will lead to failure at that point if it's in a flex joint. Even though you may think this wire is never ever going to move, it will move. I deal with lots of broken wires every day, so it happens. Chargers are really bad about the wiring harness going to the trunk breaking, and you don't want to fix wires in a flexed area. You don't want to solder them. Ideally, you want to go back further in the harness, cut that away, and then solder there in a fixed position and run new wire to where its joint is. You don't always have that option. So anyways, I'm just going to cut some of this heat shrink off. I'm going to use my handy dandy pliers again. And it cuts really easy. You can use a knife or anything like that. If you've never worked with heat shrink, it's really neat stuff. So anyways, just take your heat shrink and slide it over there. Make sure it's centered over the solder joint. Now I'm going to change the tip on my iron, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to set it over here on this plate. You guys can't see that. It's really hot. I'm only grabbing it by this plastic collar, which is really warm, by the way. You would not want to touch this. It's pretty freaking hot. So there we go. Now you can see here is the open end on it. You don't really care about that, doesn't matter. I'm going to get, roll stuff around, I'm going to get the just the little heating tip, which looks like that. It's basically just a hole. Okay, so I'm going to slip that down inside of there just like that. Kind of jiggles around for now, and then screw this back on the iron, just like so, until it's tight, no jiggling. Now again, turn it on, gas is flowing, spark the igniter, and don't look directly down in it. This is always kind of hard to get lit. For some reason, I don't know why. It was really easy when I first got it, but now it's more difficult. But that is what you're looking for, that little cherry inside of there. So, now when you heat shrink, don't use direct flame if you can avoid it. Some people will whip out a lighter and heat shrink it up. That is terrible because you'll burn it. But I am going to show you how to do that. So, don't do as I do, do as I say. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply indirect heat directly to the heat shrink, and you can see it starts to form. Now you don't want to hold it in one spot. Sometimes you can't avoid that, but you want to rotate it around and just get it to shrink. This stuff will shrink. It's the amazing shrinking material. That's why it's called heat shrink. So here we go. I like to either start in the center and work my way out, because that helps push the air out of it. Not that you really have to worry about air getting trapped. I just kind of look at things that way, like in a physics type manner, and it seems like that. Now remember I was telling you it has this little bit of adhesive inside of it. While the heat shrink is still hot, what we're going to do is take it and kind of push on it. Try to get it to seal. And I don't know how well you can see, but there's some goo that has come out of there, and that is good. That will seal off any water, any debris, anything that gets in there. It will not get in there because now it's sealed just like that. You can see that piece of heat shrink went from a good sized diameter to pretty small. Let me find the little piece that I cut off. Okay, so it went from being this big to that big. Pretty amazing stuff, right? This is the best stuff that you can use to cover exposed wire. Like I said, don't use electric tape. You can get by with it for temporary little things, but trust me, from years of experience, things that you put on that you say are temporary become permanent. So avoid it. Avoid it at all costs. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to use an open flame.